Welcome to lecture 964, and I apologize for the reversed image last time, 963. Still not really got my legs through this trip and everything. But let's continue, and I think I can start with what I did last. I reversed the camera the wrong way. And as we know from Pfeiffer et al., there is even more research coming up now. I'm thankful I am back to action here, so I can look up the literature. But the first thing I want to mention is a little apart from today's lecture, and it's a recent article about zygote twins, as we say in Sweden, enäggstvillingar. And research was done extensively very long time ago, I think already in the 30s, to see how different, what the differences were if you grew up in different circumstances. And the point from that extended research that entered into all books, all knowledge, I even had it in school, was that it didn't matter if you sort of place the twins somewhere else. They grow up to be incredibly alike anyway, in capacities and so forth. I think mainly because this was such an early insight into how twins work, that stuck, and it became a science in itself. The likeness between zygote twins, no matter where they are. And it was a big appella for heritage, and of course it was already firmly established once we learned about DNA. And it came to be part of the DNA research as an established fact. And you started with that before you did anything else, for obvious reasons. It was already established that twins are very similar, or at least that heritage is very important, extensively important. My old teacher used to say 70% is heritage. Now we know differently, and it seems, and this is actually more interesting from a deconstructive perspective than it is from a purely medical, although the medical neurological is very interesting as well. So we have two very interesting things in one go. I think my colleague Kalle always say, why not kill two flies with one stone? Well, I think this article did that. Indirectly, with the first thing I'm going to mention, how something becomes established, and unbeknownst to even the researcher, we start out with the idea that heritage is a thing. And having heritage and environment already long before we know about DNA has entered into common day language. It has entered into how we describe people. If we meet a new family, we get friends, and we discuss the children, and this has happened to me so many times, they will say, she is oddly enough very dissimilar and so forth, although the parents are very the same. So you see, it is extensive today. The almost 100 years has established this, and there doesn't seem to be any other things that could be possible. It is extensively hard to go to before 1930, when the first massive research was made. And I guess by now to what I'm referring to. I'm referring to the amnesia, amnesis, and ontic and ontological. How extensively hard it is that once something has been established, in the ontic maneuver. How do you change it? Well, you cannot criticize it. That would confirm it. You cannot divide it in some other ways. That will also confirm it. Actually, we did not even know about this ontic thing before Heidegger and quantum mechanics. Remember this. Something beneath the conceptual level is very hard to even find. That's reality. And reality is reality. And especially if it's an ontic reality, it's even more reality than normal reality. It's a reality with plus menu, as you can get in Burger King. That is in itself very interesting. And could we get rid of or change heritage versus environment? I would say no. It would be nearly impossible. We'll have to start afresh. I don't have any ideas, but I'm just going to point the new science that Ian McGilchrist is constructing could be one thing. We need an entirely new science. Otherwise, it's very hard to start anew. Although I'm not suggesting a cultural revolution. I'm not suggesting anything, just giving some ideas. Well, I could be open. It could be an opening up a new way of thinking even within these studies. The research areas of heritage versus environment. You see, I can't even name it without reinforcing the idea that those are two important factors. So that is very interesting. The second thing is, well, I think that is also incredibly interesting. In this study, there were monozygote twins, one in United States in a well-off family, secure, religious and so forth, and one in Korea. And the astonishing difference, even in this very clumsy and not to be trusted, I would say the difference is even more, but 18 IQ points. That's beyond belief. That is way more than anyone could have expected. It is massive. It's absolutely massive. It makes the whole difference. 18 points would make the difference between a person that is well functioning, can have a family, even a career. Take away 18 and you have a person who has to be hospitalized almost, or at least taken care of. So I had to even check this article because when I mention it, it seems absurdly much. I would have been more than happy with 5 or 6. That would have been enough for me. Amazing. I think this really clearly shows that we've been barking up the wrong tree completely. And Koreans do train their memory extensively, to say the least. I would say they even beat monks. Repetition is everything in Korea. It's a firm Confucian state. You do everything with your hand. Well, at least that was the case 20 years ago. But see, the neighboring countries, hand is important. Do things with your hand. And that has to rely on a tradition that's old. I would say 3,000 years old. It's accumulated knowledge in the movement. We know from fractality the only thing that can store that enormous amount of information is movement itself. Because in that fractality, that fern-like nature of our movement, when we move about, it can store an infinite amount of information. And I'd say it could even be more than infinite. Because remember quantum mechanics. We don't even have to say we're speaking about real numbers or natural numbers. In the end, it's just massive amount of knowing. As you remember, a quantum computer can have 0 and 1, and a third thing, superposition. That sort of exponentially, or even more than exponentially, make the amount possible to be stored in a movement even more. And for me, that makes a lot of sense. I always seen movement of the Asian people as being incredibly smooth, careful, quick, agile, and also forceful, reacting in a manner that is out of any expectation from my side. Catching things, I remember dropping a coffee cup at a McDonald's filled with coffee, and somebody catched it. That person was himself ordering something in McDonald's. How that was possible, it just amazed me. But you see, pretension, retention, the ability to plan, the ability to inform the planning with knowing, which is retention, that works to a level that is way beyond this 18 points difference. Maybe they are 3 times as intelligent as us. Or when we get other ways of measure this, we can start measuring movement, which will happen scarily quick, I think, because now artificial intelligence has gotten hold about movement. And then we will notice their movement is extensively, both in delta depth and in delta width, more complex. More now. Their now is much larger and deeper, which means they can perform more thinking process at the same time. Almost like a quantum computer can do, if we want to keep with the analogy with a computer. And you can imagine what possibilities lie therein. And since they don't use the law of the excluded middle, they won't have any problems with contradiction, different levels. So they can make, so to speak, each level more consistent, more directed, more working, more forceful. So that was that about the article. Book is ordered, hopefully on its way. But I hope it takes some time so I can finish off with Susie Frobel. No, I shouldn't say that. Susie Frobel should take a year. The name of the lecture today, I should have mentioned that earlier, is how other people influence us. Not only as individuals that we sort of have connections to at work, school, in sports, but also people that you don't know. The people on the bus, the people you are closer to than 10 meters, or something like that. We know, because of the mirror neurons, that we always participate in a sort of another type of horizon meets horizon. This is horizon taken from the hermeneutic ideas. That thing is constantly going on, even with complete strangers. And we can gain complexity, and we can also sort of go down the complexity scale. The ones that are close to us have a lower amount of complexity. We will also acquire a lower amount of complexity. I wouldn't say that there are very big differences, but you can compare to this environment. I'm in a woodland mixed with deciduous and coniferous woods. Here it's a perfect example of something that has great influence on my thinking process, how my body moves and go about. This is healthy fractality. And this is beginning to be discovered among scientists. But this has been going on in Asia for centuries, remember Feng Shui, and now they have something called wood swimming or wood bathing, where people go out into the woods an hour or two just to get this higher complexity that is given by the woods. Especially affected is the intellectual area, which diminishes greatly in an environment with a fractal coefficient that is not healthy for humans. Take for instance the suburban areas of Sweden, built in the late 60s, in the early 70s, called the Million Program, to make 1,000,000 apartments, but they are all unhealthy, and the environment outside has a fractality that is discouraging, to say the least. This is an effect you cannot shield yourself from. It's immediate, and it's happening all the time, and it will sort of lower your already low fractality if that is the problem. Go into the woods and heighten your fractality, and also heighten your perception of complicated manners or matters, because that is what you are losing in these suburbs, the complexity of thinking. The repetitious and constantly performed thinking will be the same, but what will disappear is the finer nuances, what we would call intellectual, the sharpness, the creativity, that gets lost. Another fractality, and that's the theme for today's lecture, is other people. I mentioned earlier on how in Oxford it's very important with the pubs. I think there is about 150 pubs only in Oxford. They are all to talk in, to exchange ideas, but also be close to one each other and gaining in fractality. Doesn't mean that you actually have to speak to everyone. Somebody with a complex fractality will sort of affect you directly. You will gain, almost like in a woodland, acquire more complexity, more grace, more adjustment. A rather good example is also the fractality of language. Korean, for instance, it is highly complicated with different levels interacting in each other, where you speak on different planes at the same time, often called honorifics, but they are much more than just honorifics. They also have this very complicated way of telling now and telling here, which makes our now and our here seem like a vast oversimplification or guesswork, as I think was the first thing that came to mind. Here is not even vaguely precise enough to tell about localization. They constantly define here as in connection to other perspectives, thereby triangulating, which is a rather fitting term. It doesn't have to be 3, it could be 4, 5, 6, but triangulating in the fractal dimension from different sources or poles. Let me give an example. Other people, you tell where you're situated in contrast to other people in a very, very advanced way, I would say. Really takes care of the deeper dimensions in reality. It is not a localization in this 3 dimensions that will only work on the paper. This is an active localization it is actually a quantum mechanical localization. It is simply not enough to tell about things that sort of exist somewhere. So yes, oddly enough, Schrödinger's cat wouldn't be as problematic to a Korean as it would to us. I think it still would be problematic. It would not be as one of those verb-free languages like Hopi or something. But I would think it would cause much less damage. To talk about existence in Korean and not being specific, if that could be the correct term, that doesn't work. And in a way, in our perspective, the very unspecified gestalt of our idea of localization, both when it comes to here and now, and I would say knowledge too, that helps to reinforce this idea. We get used to it, we grow up with it, we think we use those terms in an accurate way, so to speak. And here can actually be one of those odd instances where there is almost sort of a no, I had to formulate it like this, I have to be careful. This sort of breaks my understanding of philosophical investigations by Ludwig Wittgenstein. This could be one of those things that actually break the language game, but I'm not too sure. But from my perspective, this is how it is. It is sort of at least questioning my understanding of the language game. Because here and now are working perfectly well in language game, this is how I see it, and now they're getting questioned by quantum mechanics. But possibly they never worked, and we didn't have the means to sort of discover that they're not working. And I think one of those two explanations, either is I who misunderstood Wittgenstein to a good degree, which is natural because we have understanding horizons, or it is that the language game hasn't been working that good and we haven't had the possibility to actually notice it. And this goes hand in hand with the forgetfulness. We also forget for that we forget, which makes the matters a little bit worse. It seems from that perspective the Heideggerian challenge could be very hard in the beginning, could be too hard, and most possibly could be that you don't even give it up because you not understand where the problems lies, and you go into the book being in time and you get used to the idea of there being two modes. I actually met a person who had this, ontic and ontological, but I noticed after, it took me 2 years until I understood that there was not a firmly established understanding of the fundamental difference. I would say fundamental, not meaning extensive, rather that you never discover that deeper dimension of the difference. And that is still quite all right to use the terms exchangeable to a certain degree. You can use the ontic mode, and you don't have to specify whether it's the ontic or ontological. But in where it really counts, you need to be specific. Is this ontological or is it ontic? Is it the before mode or is it the after mode? In regular speech, it is of course always okay to use the ontic mode, I'd say 99%. Whereas if you do philosophy, you have to be a bit sharper. Or if you want to think about those things like time, fractal time in Susie Frobel, you need to rethink. And this is what can be contributed by the book by Susie Frobel. It will further the understanding of being in time. You will think once more, if you have read the book, if you have an understanding, that understanding can now deepen. You don't have to reconstruct the understanding or block it out. And I would say that is partly one of the goals in doing the book. We need to know we've done a mistake, we became ontic, but how do we go to ontological once it's established? And it is extensively hard to do that. Fractality can actually help here. Fractality can show that there is fractality going on already in the ontic mode. And thereby you don't have to leave the ontic mode. And you can sort of postpone your understanding of the difference of ontological and ontic until that very moment it strikes you like this. That would be okay. So we can also see, and this is very important, fractality as a pedagogical tool, much needed pedagogical tool. And it's not enough to say like Mulder in the Archive X-Files, the truth is out there. We need a ladder, to use a Wittgensteinian metaphor. We need a ladder to go to that place, and that ladder needs to have steps. We cannot present the whole thing in one go. It's like almost similar to if you want to construct some complicated mechano thing. If you have a child 10 years old and you just take this big box of mechano toys you used in the 70s or 80s, whenever you used it, and just pour it on the table in front of the little kid and tell her or him, put it together now, here is the drawing, do it like this is how I did it. And in that case you both forgotten how difficult it was for you, because you only remember the good stuff, problem with memory once more. And you will put the kid in a very awkward spot. Maybe when the kids see you put the things together, which you still know, unaware, you're not even aware that you know that, but you will be able to. And you can at the same time read the drawing to help you remember those bits and pieces that have become less accessible during the 20, 30, 40 years. And that will put the difference even worse for the poor kid, and he will hate mechano for the rest of his life. It happened to a friend of mine. He started to hate mechano, and he changed his career accordingly. Never wanted to have anything to do with anything that was vaguely mechanical, technical, or complicated. We will notice the same with human beings. We need to start easy out. Don't move to Korea and try to interact with the people there. The difference in background knowledge makes it hard. I would say the complexity level would also make it extensively hard. I remember my time in Japan, how hard it was to communicate, even if you got the language. And that's difference in complexity levels. I had great problem handling different meanings at the same time. And I wanted the situation to be more or less one-sided. And I could always, sometimes I even did this most devastating mistake of asking for explanations, which made things, of course, even worse. We know that people relax when they are together. Closeness is important. The distance shouldn't be too far for fractality to enter from one place to another. And there is a sort of a stabilization occurring. You have a lot of people together with high fractality, that fractality will be even higher if they're close together. Whereas the fractality level is low, and you put the people together, the general fractality will actually lower. So we're in the West, so make do with few people. That could actually be handled, and that could actually enhance. Because still, we have the meeting of horizon, especially if you interact verbally, start talking to the person, start approaching the other person, start being yourself as much as you can, which I would say is also a training thing. Try to be honest so much you can in the beginning. That will interact beneficially with your own complexity. This, I remember now, one of the professors I had a lot of help with before, a professor in quantum physics from Berkeley, and he said in that very vulnerable time when he sort of changed worldview, going from the classical physical worldview to have another worldview, or a doubling of worldview, which is in itself as challenging as to have a shifting worldview. He was greatly helped by going, he was living in the States by then, going to coffee shops, sitting, chatting to people, truck drivers, whomever. And that sort of eased the whole thing. It opened his system. And we also know that the fractality of space can come easier once you have people around you to sort of make your space happen. There's somebody behind me, that helps. Living creatures are also fairly good. That's why I usually mention geese, flock of geese going above you. It's good if they're alive, but it's even better if they are actual, really alive. This is not something you can easily make up. What you can do is you can do a pretension, a directed idea of a geese flock, but it would be even better that it came an actual geese flock. Then you have a proper meeting, and then you get a more decisive spaciousness. And as I mentioned before, localization in languages where it's more complex, more specific, and more general at the same time, showing a better depth in both space and time, which I shall return to later in another lecture, how time is perceived in the East. But once you get deeper into that, you will also take advantage of language, a language that uses more of the complexity in the fractality. And it is a sort of localization that is not fixed in a point in a diagram, a piece of paper on a computer screen, an origo of that sort, but a more flexible one. A sense of you actually do that starting point. You really start out here. And I would say an absolute necessity to be somewhere else is that you are located in the very spot you are. If you are on your toes, that will affect all of your thinking, all of your intellectualization, all of your bodily health, all of your bodily fractality. It starts with you in some way. And I think we can advance within our own language quite extensively without having to go to some other country. And I would say even we have to start here because this is our past. I do remember when I was thinking about this lecture, a certain sense of difference when I spoke to my elders. Especially there was some friend of my grandpa, and he was much older than grandpa. There was a different sense of being localized. They could go into some place they didn't know about and still find their way, sort of. And I remember that sort of amazed me. This friend Arne, going into my grandpa's tool shed for the first time in his life, still finding his ways. localization is important. And although I'm quite certain none of the tools were situated in the same place as in his tool shed, there is knowledge in space. And that knowledge we can only access by being fractal. So don't think of it as that he has a map of different tool sheds and you can use those maps to sort of superimpose them, transpond them on each other, and therefore sort of localize the tools in my grandpa's tool shed. No, don't think in that way. That is just an explanation. Space in itself has the knowledge. And once you start to learn about space, you will see that space carry information in itself. And I would like to refer once more to Stephen Wolfram, that fantastic English mathematician. And he said already in the late 80s that we can get rid of objects. It's more enough with space to define everything, to understand everything. And that is also an opening to quantum mechanics. The very idea of saying that knowledge can only be in the objects and our interaction with objects, that will make an unnecessary limitation on what we can know. And that goes for the tool shed here. And I would say there is a connection between personalities as well. Learning different personalities will also learn you how to sort of localize in space. It's all about fractality and what you're sending out. And quantum mechanics is saying exactly that. It's enough with space. Remember the experiment that Stephen Maggold showed us, well, at least Henrik and Kalle, who participated in the last meeting, and hopefully in the next meeting as well. That is that shows amplitude and frequencies is enough. We don't need objects. It's a bit more than that even. We can gain more information. And I would say that's the ontic versus the ontological once more. By saying we can only gain knowledge from the objects preemptively, a priori, we make a random division before we meet space, before we go into the fractality of space. It's okay to do it afterwards, yes? And we need objects for language. Language, as I said, in my oversimplification, mainly ontic. My works fine with the ontic mode. But it can be a good idea to see space as a source of knowledge. We mentioned already in the episodes way back in the 200 series or 300 series, maybe it was in Jonsered, that space in itself carries a lot of knowledge. And empty space, I think I said at that time, empty space is not sheer empty space. Permit me to rephrase that. That, I think, was a step on the ladder, not absolutely correct for this level. Better to say that space in itself is the sine qua non for existence. It comes in an ontological way before. And therefore we don't have to say that empty space is fantastic, which it is. It carries a lot of things. But at a preemptive level, it doesn't really make sense to divide the world into existence qua non-existence. As of course, Auge Bohr also tried to point out. Why do it? It diminishes the possibility of making accurate predictions. And it makes for a lessening of understanding because it introduces randomness into experience. Instead of letting experience come to you, you say that it already consists of certain objects which you have stored, that has a connection to your memory bank and so forth, and you gain this passivity in your projection because you already have your whole head, your whole movement, frequency, fractality stored up by like a smoother curve that don't carry so much, and it actually obliterates or diminish the possibility of a healthy interaction with the outside. Learning that once more, I think we had that knowledge when we were younger, is alleviated and helped by entering into the other people's life. And it's important to treat other people with respect, and that to make the situation more elegant. It is more beauty to help each other than not help each other. That's the sense of something already lying in the world, I would say. That's part of the knowledge of the world. A knowledge that's lost and completely lost on people like Torbjörn Tännsjö. But that is how he perceives the world. Cannot be helped. In a low fractality, you are gruesome. You are destined to be, as a Japanese person would say, you are destined to be reborn as a chikusha, a devil. Something of a lower level of complication. And that doesn't necessarily mean in our biology a lesser being. Maybe it means a lesser human or lesser thing, fractality-wise. Space in itself, and that shows, of course, once more that we orient ourselves according to other people. That's the best way to do it. And I would say maybe there's a training, it's a James Clarion training period there for a year or two, maybe, I don't know. Interacting with people more, making you more relaxed with other people, taking down your barriers a little bit, approach a stranger, have a chat. I would try to add an article I saw just before here that shows that even those short meetings with strangers, 10 to 15 minutes, we often feel they were really awkward and they can't lead anything. And once you've taken away the subject of weather, the inflation and the escalating gasoline prices, you have nothing to talk about. And this, well, investigation from England show that not to be the case. Most often come up with new interesting things, and it's creative as well. And I just have a conversation with a nice couple before here. I opened the conversation, said it's not a little bit too chilly today in the wind and everything. We start talking about the weather, which is usually the start, and then all of a sudden we start talking about cars. We both had antique cars, as he mentioned it. And then he actually said something out of the blue. And this shows that fractality has this serendipity aspect to it. He said, most elderly women prefer Toyota Corolla because they don't have to change, or whatever that is in English, I don't know, the camera, that transmission cord, maybe. I was a bit surprised, to be honest. I'm supposed to be an engineer. I was a bit taken aback, and I played it cool. And then he asked me, is it the same with your car? My model is a slightly bit bigger than Corolla. And I said yes. And I know now, especially after reading this article, he didn't know my assistance. I had to check it out on the internet. Is it true I don't have to change the transmission cord on my car? And I realized all of a sudden, this is something I never thought of. I know that by heart, that you change the transmission cord usually after a period of 6 to 8 years, somewhere in that vicinity, or 9,000, 10,000 Swedish miles. Thank God it turned out I don't have a transmission cord. So first I got a bit nervous and then I got relieved. But I think that shows that this was completely unexpected, and this is definitely not a normal conversation. And the chance me having that with people I already know, I would say it's slim to none. That needs really that spontaneous, in a way, my fractality was, my horizon towards that person was maybe in some ways not as complex, because it's a stranger, I can't have any conception. But it was still very, very determinate. He is a stranger, he has this feature, he was that sort of person. And that was a really big meet, because there was such a difference between my expectation, which I think is very important, that those expectations are really different. And when they were met, something energetic happened. And I would say that is a good way of explaining what happens when you meet strangers. It is creativity, and it's also somewhat similar to that of Edward de Bono, asymmetric thinking. Is you need to put in a moment of chance to have, explained by Susie Froebel, a greater fractality, explained by Edward de Bono, to have a moment of creativity where you reconstruct everything. The thing that doesn't really fit into your consistent system, and sort of make a symmetry break, and you get this asymmetric thinking, which I think is a rather clumsy term by Edward de Bono, but then that's the actual point of creativity. The same point as in the joke, you are zeroing in. That's actually a better expression, also from Edward de Bono, at 0 point. You zero in for a moment. When the two horizons that are so different, we cannot find common ground, which is good, because then you have this jocular break of consistency, and you have a source of energy. And you often laugh a little bit. You don't laugh right out, but the person I spoke to in this example, this real example, we both laughed a bit when our two different horizons sort of met, and in the very difference there was a lot to gain. And it was sort of a invention from my part. I wouldn't call myself Edison. Most people are quite aware about the transmission cord. But I became aware, and thanks to the internet and Google, I also became consoled within 5 minutes, which is another problem that I won't mention now, but I realized afterwards, going directly to the computer and try to relieve your anxiety for what is happening with the car will make you less resilient towards adversities in your real life. You can just go into Google. I think that would actually lessen the complexity level, the can we call it conflict that is within you. You have this anxiousness, and you can see it as a meet between two horizons within yourself. That you have this stability you had before, you know about the transmission cord, and then you have this new era where you have this uncertainty and worrying start slipping in slowly. And because of Google, I couldn't be completely worried. It didn't have time to slip in. Maybe it's important that it's worried. Worrying would have slipped in, because that possibly would make oneself less resilient. Because resilient is one of those things that I think we should train, because that makes our system much more stable. And in the end, that's the only way of making the system stable. And you feel much more balanced. And This is of course the reasons why it could be so hard to let space come in, because you almost feel space to be too different. You're used to this, you know what you have, you don't know what you don't have, and you linger on into an idea that the body ends by your skin. Dermatic borderline. Dermatic borderline syndrome, we could call it. DBS. We can call it DBS, dermatic borderline syndrome. Where you preemptively think that your body ended where you last saw it. Expand into space is threatening in the beginning, not to a great degree, but let it in. Every time you do that, you will acquire the skill of letting space in. And then you can take that to a social situation. I don't like the word social, interaction, or just having friends, or meeting strangers, being happy. You take that into that new thing, and once you want to shut yourself down in defense of what you have, you don't know what you don't have, you can open up a bit. Don't have to open everything up, but open up a bit, take in space and take in awareness. And you will also notice then, most interesting, there is something happening with time when you do that. Time gets extended. So we can take help of space also to extend time. As soon as my background and my upside comes in, I see and feel a very small expansion of time as well. And this is of course delta t width. And slowly, little by little, I noticed that problems of doing things on a simultaneous basis, which is very problematic for me, is getting easier and easier. Little by little, not a great deal, but little by little. And me understanding that the space around me, from a mathematical perspective, from a scientific perspective, but also from a biological perspective, because the dermatic borderline syndrome is wrong. It is actually absolutely scientifically wrong. Our bodies do not end with the skin. And for me to have this anatomically correct but scientifically incorrect view of my body will do the same thing with my body as we do with objects. We preemptively assume them to exist because of memory and all that linear time with movements, and you ruminated with these things, and you use your stamp to decide whether that was a correct memory or not. And when you build your future, you don't do that by pretension. You're putting all scenarios together, using the old to understand the new, a little bit like trying to use logic to come to an invention, which is in the wrong order. So metaphysics of presence is actually also a complete misunderstanding what is a now. But although it is completely fit to call it the search for now, because our lack that we feel in our system is caused by not having access to now. But what we think is now, it's impossible to achieve. And if it was possible, you would not want to be there, I can say. But thank God it's not possible. I also feel it's now is easier to do I do verses, 33 verses. I can do them at the same time I'm talking to you now here. Something that was very hard before, when having no one to sort of relate to. Now I can do it also with this camera. I know you're looking maybe somewhere out there later on, but it's not really the same thing. But now I can do it without having people there. So let's see what happens when I get a live human being behind the camera. It will be quite interesting actually. I also noticed that when I stand up wherever, not just here when I do lectures, when I stand up, automatically there is greater separation between my feet. I don't have to consciously do that. And that comes from taking in space, which makes me more balanced. So there is a positive spiral. The body therefore gets accustomed to balance and therefore wants it, and therefore puts myself in a position where I get balance. And this is going to be an unconscious habit in the end. You will do it automatically. And I'd say after half a year, you will have to force yourself to stand in an unbalanced position. You will still have to do it in occasions where there is no space, maybe in the subway or something like that, but you will have actually to force yourself. Once it becomes unconscious, you also have a very good platform to expand other things. You don't have to think about it actively. So you gain more than, you kill more than two flies with one stone. So there's like 3 or 4 going on. Both expand the level of thinking, you will make them interpenetrative, but you will also gain a balance that in the end doesn't need to be forcefully projected. It will happen by itself. So you see, once you get the foundations, everything gets easier. It's important to trust the process, especially in the beginning. Well, standing tall, I say thank you very much. I wish you a very pleasant afternoon, which I think it is now. Bye bye for now. Look at fractal nature all over the place.